There is a border somewhere in the world that has not moved in 70 years. Both sides have massive armies facing each other every single day. Both sides have missiles pointed at each other right now as we speak. The whole world has been expecting this to explode for 7 decades, but it never does. And when you actually sit down and study this, when you follow the money, when you apply basic game theory, you start to realize something very uncomfortable. Maybe it was never supposed to explode. Maybe the people who benefit most from this situation are not the ones trying to end it. Maybe they are the ones making sure it never ends. Now, before I continue, I want to be very clear about something. I am not an expert, okay? I don't have a PhD. I'm not a professor at some fancy university. What I do is I look at the world through the lens of game theory and economics, and I ask very simple questions. Who benefits? Who loses? And who has the power to change this situation but chooses not to? And when you ask those questions about this particular conflict, the answers will surprise you. Okay, let's begin. So first, let me tell you what everyone already knows. This is the mainstream story. This is what they teach you in school. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States came in to defend the South. China came in to defend the North. After 3 years of brutal fighting, approximately 5 million people died. And in 1953, both sides signed an armistice. Now here is something very important that most people don't know. They did not sign a peace treaty, okay? They signed an armistice, which means they agreed to stop shooting. They did not agree the war was over. So technically, and this is not a metaphor, this is literally true, the Korean War is still happening right now, today, as I am making this video. Now, the mainstream explanation for why this has never been resolved is very simple. North Korea is a crazy dictatorship run by a lunatic family. The South wants peace, but the North won't allow it. The Americans want stability, but the North is unpredictable. So we are all just stuck waiting for the North Korean regime to eventually collapse on its own. That is the story, okay? And look, I understand why people believe this. It makes sense on the surface. North Korea does crazy things. Kim Jong Un makes insane threats. The country has concentration camps and a starving population. But here is my problem with this explanation. If North Korea is so weak, so poor, so isolated, so backward, why has the most powerful military in human history not been able to resolve this in 70 years? The Americans defeated Nazi Germany in 4 years. They defeated Imperial Japan in 4 years. They built the atomic bomb in 3 years. They put a man on the moon. They built the internet. But they cannot solve North Korea, a country with no navy, no air force worth mentioning, an economy the size of a small city. That doesn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense, that's when you need to start asking better questions. So in game theory, there is a very simple concept that changes how you see everything. Before you try to understand why a problem exists, you must first ask whether everyone involved actually wants it solved. Because if powerful players benefit from the problem continuing, the problem will never be solved. No matter how many negotiations happen, no matter how many summits, no matter how many sanctions, no matter how many angry speeches at the United Nations, the problem continues because powerful people need it to continue. So let us apply this to Korea. Let us look at every major player in this situation and ask one simple question. Does this player actually benefit from peace? Let's start with North Korea. Now, everyone says North Korea wants reunification. The Kim family talks about it constantly. It's written into their constitution. It's their official national goal. But think about this carefully. Right now, Kim Jong Un is a god, literally worshipped as a divine figure by 25 million people. He has total control, total power. Nobody questions him. Nobody challenges him. He lives like a king while his people starve, and the entire world can do nothing about it. Now imagine reunification happens tomorrow. Suddenly, Kim Jong Un is just a politician in a unified country of 75 million people, 50 million of whom grew up in a democracy, have smartphones, watch foreign films, and have opinions. Does Kim Jong Un survive reunification? Does his family survive? Do his generals survive? No, okay? Reunification is not liberation for North Korean elites. Reunification is a death sentence for them personally. So the first player, the North Korean ruling class, does not actually want reunification. They want the threat of reunification. They want to use the idea for propaganda. But the reality of it, terrifying for them. Now let us look at South Korea. South Korea right now is one of the most successful economies in the world. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, K-pop, Korean cinema. South Korea built something remarkable in one generation. Now imagine reunification. Let me give you a real historical example to understand what this actually means. West Germany reunified with East Germany in 1990. Remember what happened to the West German economy after that? It struggled enormously for a decade because suddenly they had to absorb 17 million people who had no experience with capitalism, no modern infrastructure, no competitive industries. And East Germany was relatively small compared to West Germany. North Korea has 25 million people, most of them malnourished, almost none with marketable skills for a modern economy. Infrastructure from the 1950s, zero private sector experience whatsoever. If South Korea absorbs North Korea tomorrow, the economic cost is estimated between $2 and $5 trillion, roughly 10 times South Korea's entire annual GDP. South Korean economists have studied this carefully, and what they found is that reunification could set the South Korean economy back by 20 to 30 years. So South Korea's economic elite, the people who actually run that country, do not want rapid reunification. They want the border exactly where it is: stable, predictable, manageable. Now let us look at China, and this is where it gets really interesting. China shares a long border with North Korea and has always been North Korea's main protector and economic lifeline. Everyone knows this. But the question nobody asks is why? Why does China support this embarrassing, unpredictable regime that threatens nuclear war every few months? The standard explanation is that China and North Korea are communist brothers, ideological allies, but that is nonsense. China is not really communist anymore. China is a state capitalist country that cares about one thing: economic growth and national power. They have zero ideological attachment to North Korea. The real reason is much more practical. Right now, on the Korean Peninsula, there are approximately 28,000 American troops based in South Korea, with advanced missile systems, advanced surveillance equipment. From South Korea, the Americans can monitor everything happening in northeastern China. Now, if North Korea collapses, if the regime falls, what happens? South Korea absorbs the North, and suddenly American troops and American missile systems are sitting directly on China's border. That is China's nightmare. That is the one thing China absolutely cannot allow. So China needs North Korea to exist, not to thrive, not to be powerful, just to exist as a buffer state between China and American military power. Like a wall that China is willing to pay for indefinitely. So the third player, China, does not want Korean reunification under American terms, and they will do everything necessary to prevent it. Now the last player, the United States, and this is the most interesting one. Everyone assumes America desperately wants to solve the North Korea problem. America wants denuclearization. America wants peace. America wants stability. But let us follow the money, okay? Just follow the money. Right now, because of the North Korean threat, Japan spends billions of dollars every year on American military equipment. Patriot missile systems, F-35 fighter jets, advanced radar systems, all bought from American defense contractors. South Korea does exactly the same. Every time North Korea conducts a missile test, and they do this regularly, South Korea and Japan immediately announce new defense spending, new weapons purchases, all from America. The North Korean threat is essentially a permanent marketing campaign for the American military-industrial complex. Every missile test North Korea conducts is worth billions of dollars in new weapons contracts for American companies. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not saying America created North Korea for this purpose. I am not saying there is some secret meeting where American generals and Kim Jong Un plan the next missile test together. That would be crazy. What I am saying is much more subtle and much more important. When a situation benefits you, you have very little incentive to change it. That is basic human nature. That is basic institutional behavior. You don't fix what isn't broken for you. And look at the pattern over 70 years. Every time there is a diplomatic breakthrough with North Korea, every time negotiations get serious, something happens to derail them. The North Koreans make an unreasonable demand at the last moment, or the Americans impose new sanctions right when talks are progressing, or there is a new missile test that kills the momentum. And then everyone throws up their hands and says, you see, you cannot negotiate with these people. This is hopeless. But if you look at this pattern over 70 years and ask who benefits every single time talks collapse, the answer is always the same group of people. Defense contractors, intelligence agencies that justify enormous budgets based on the Korean threat. Politicians who win elections by being tough on North Korea. These people do not benefit from peace. They benefit from managed tension, not war, because real war would be catastrophic and unpredictable, and nobody wants that. But permanent tension, permanent threat, permanent crisis that never quite boils over. This is what I want you to understand. There is a middle position between war and peace that is extremely profitable for a small number of powerful people. And that middle position is exactly where the Korean Peninsula has been for 70 years. Now let us look at the economics more carefully, because this is where it gets truly fascinating. South Korea right now is the 10th largest economy in the world. It has achieved what economists call the miracle on the Han River, transforming from one of the poorest countries in Asia in 1950 to a high technology powerhouse in one generation. And here is something most people do not know. A significant portion of South Korea's early economic development was directly funded by American military spending, American bases, American soldiers spending money locally, American contracts for Korean companies to supply the military. In other words, the Korean War, or more precisely, the permanent state of almost war, was an economic development program for South Korea disguised as a military conflict. The tension that everyone sees as a problem was actually the engine of South Korean prosperity. Now look at North Korea. Everyone says it is a failed state, an economic disaster. And yes, for ordinary North Korean citizens, it absolutely is. The poverty is real, the hunger is real, the human rights abuses are real, and they are horrifying. But for the ruling class, for the Kim family and their inner circle, the isolation is not a punishment. The isolation is a business model. Because the country is completely isolated, because ordinary citizens have no access to outside information, the ruling class can extract enormous wealth from the population with zero accountability, zero transparency, zero consequences, and the sanctions actually help them. Every time America imposes new sanctions, the regime tells its people, "You are poor because of American aggression." Without America's hostility, we would be prosperous. The sanctions give the regime a permanent excuse for its own failures and a permanent reason for its own existence. And the nuclear program, the missile tests, these serve two purposes simultaneously. First, they guarantee the regime's survival because nobody invades a nuclear-armed state. Nobody. Second, they generate enormous international attention, and every time North Korea threatens something, the international community offers food aid and economic concessions to calm things down. So the North Korean elite has actually built a very rational business model around being a permanent threat. It is not crazy. It is calculated. It is working exactly as designed. Now here is the most interesting economic point of everything I have said today. Look at this region on the map. You have China to the north, Russia to the northeast, because North Korea also shares a small border with Russia, Japan to the east, South Korea to the south. This is one of the most economically dynamic regions in the entire world. China is the second largest economy. Japan is the third. South Korea is 10th. The combined economic power of this region is extraordinary. And right in the middle of all this sits North Korea, with enormous untapped natural resources, estimated at $6 to $10 trillion worth of rare earth minerals, coal, iron ore, copper, sitting completely undeveloped because of the political situation. $6 to $10 trillion, just sitting there, underground, untouched. When this situation eventually resolves, and it will resolve, these things always do, whoever controls access to North Korean resources will make an extraordinary amount of money. This is not speculation. This is just geography and geology. And guess who is already quietly positioning for that moment? China. China has been building infrastructure along the North Korean border for 2 decades. Roads, bridges, industrial zones, all ready to connect the moment the border opens. So China's strategy is actually very elegant. Keep North Korea stable enough to prevent American troops moving to the Chinese border, but develop all the infrastructure needed to profit enormously the moment reunification or regime change happens. You maintain the wall and you also build the door, and you are the only one with the key. So now the big question. How does this end? I want to give you 3 scenarios based purely on game theory and economics. The first scenario is nothing changes. The current situation continues for another 20 or 30 years. This is actually the most likely scenario in the short term because, as we have discussed, most of the powerful players prefer the status quo. Managed tension continues. Defense spending continues. The Kim regime continues. Nobody is happy, but everybody important is comfortable. And comfortable people do not change things. The second scenario is economic collapse of North Korea. The regime becomes so economically stressed that it cannot maintain control of its own military and internal security apparatus. This is what happened to the Soviet Union. Not a military defeat, an economic implosion that happened faster than anyone predicted. If this happens to North Korea, the regime could collapse quite suddenly. And then China moves immediately to fill the vacuum, not with military force, but with economic infrastructure and investment. South Korea absorbs the population. China controls the resources. America loses its justification for military bases in the region. This is actually China's preferred outcome if reunification must happen. The third scenario is a grand bargain, and this is the most interesting one. What if the right combination of incentives was offered to every player simultaneously? What if America agreed to reduce its military presence in South Korea in exchange for denuclearization? What if China guaranteed massive investment in North Korean reconstruction? What if South Korea agreed to a gradual reunification over 20 years rather than immediate absorption? What if North Korean elites were guaranteed safety and immunity rather than prosecution? Every player gets something. America saves money, China gets economic access, South Korea avoids economic shock, North Korean elites get to survive. It is theoretically possible. The reason this has not happened is not because it is impossible. It is because it requires all players to trust each other simultaneously. And right now, that trust does not exist between any of them. But here is my prediction. And again, this is just game theory speculation, not prophecy, not certainty, just a framework for thinking about where this goes. As the global economy becomes more unstable, as the competition between America and China intensifies over the next decade, the Korean Peninsula will become too expensive for everyone to maintain in its current frozen state. The cost of permanent tension will eventually exceed the benefits for enough players at the same time. And when that happens, when the cost-benefit calculation shifts, this situation will resolve with remarkable speed, just like the Berlin Wall came down overnight, just like the Soviet Union collapsed in months after decades of seeming permanence. Everyone will be shocked by how fast it happens. But looking back, it will seem completely inevitable, because that is how these things always end. Not with a bang, not with a war, but with a quiet moment when enough powerful people simultaneously decide that the old arrangement no longer serves them. And on that day, whenever it comes, the border that has not moved in 70 years will simply disappear, and the world will move on to the next frozen conflict, the next managed tension, the next war that was never supposed to end. Okay? We will continue this next week.